All right, this is our fourth session of the Georgia School of Preaching course on Genesis for fall of 2019. And we are looking at a video called Is Genesis History? And I think it's just really informative as to the creationist perspective, or what's the word that they used last week? It wasn't perspective, but it was what? A new word. I guess it's a new word for us all. There are two perspectives.
Paradigm.
But what was the word he used?
Creative paradigm.
Paradigm, that's it. Two paradigms. There's a creation paradigm, and there's what they call the contemporary paradigm, which is what you learn in school, that you came from apes and fish and birds and stuff like that. And of course, we're looking at the creation paradigm, but I want you to understand that it's not just hocus pocus. It's not just that we have a Bible and say, well, this is what God said, and that's enough. Well, it is enough for us, but it's not that the Bible is actually contrary to science. It's contrary to evolutionary science, and evolutionary science is not, they count it as a fact, but it's not. They count it as a teachable science law or law of science, but it's just simply not.
Mike, if you can hear me, your volume gone. Still can't hear you.
How's that?
Okay, you back now.
That's better? Okay, I may have to change.
Yes, sir.
Again, when I start the video, I'll have to probably change the microphone. It's been contrary today. I don't know why.
All right.
All right, what I was saying was that the two paradigms, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, sir. I can hear you.
All right. The two paradigms are in conflict with one another, but the biblical paradigm is not in conflict with science. And if we don't get anything else from the video and from Genesis chapter 1 and 2, then that's what I want us to get. The biblical paradigm is not in conflict with science. It is in conflict with evolutionary science or evolutionary theory, but it's not in conflict with science. In our first clip tonight, we're going to talk about fossils, how that there are billions and billions of fossils. Most of those fossils are from pre-flood animals. Some of them, however, are from post-flood or after the flood animals. Imagine when God said he broke up the fountains of the deep. It's hard for me to see that taking place and how it took place, but imagine volcanoes erupting everywhere, earthquakes happening everywhere. If there is an earthquake today, what is the usual result of that in the oceans? Any ideas?
Probably mountains.
Sorry?
I was going to say mountains.
Well, in the oceans, if there's an earthquake in California or earthquake in, I don't know, some coastal land, there's a impact upon the oceans. The wave, the tidal wave that is formed because of that is going to go and gather bigger force depending on the size of the earthquake. The tidal wave or tsunami is going to be huge, and it can destroy. Remember what it did to, we talked about it a little bit last week, Indonesia a few years back. It just basically swept over the island. Imagine that happening on a world scale. Imagine the tidal wave going this way because the earthquake is that direction and it pushed the waters this way. And then, it just overcomes a whole continent or practically a whole continent. And then an earthquake happens over here and it pushes the water back. What's going on in that water when it's going back and forth like that? It's not happening in a day or in a minute, but it's happening over a series of weeks. What's happening in that water? It's all churned up, right? And when it settles down, what's going to happen? Well, the heavy stuff goes to the bottom, the lighter stuff to the top. And if that water is on top of a continent, it's going to do the same thing there that it does in the bottom of the sea. And that's what the picture is in the Earth's surface throughout. And imagine in all that turmoil, you've got dead bodies of people, dinosaurs, elephants, whatever, and they're being churned up and all that too. You're also finding trees that are being overturned, and that's why you find trees in various places. He'll talk about that later on. Well, that's what we're finding here, or what he's going to look at here in this first clip about fossils and how they were formed, and the sediments and how they happened again. So I'm going to turn your attention to him. He's going to talk about trackways, Trackways. Listen for that and see what, try to tell me what you think about what he said about trackways. Also listen to what he says about how complex fossils are found in layers that the evolutionary scientists scratch their head about. How can this fossil be here? It's too early or for that fossil. That animal came around 2 billion years later. It can't be here, but yet it's there. Try to understand what he's going to say about that. Let me see if I can get it started. Y'all flag me down if you can't hear it, okay?
Okay.
That's what Second Peter says. That's the error people make. It's reasonable. Take the present and extend it into the past. Unreasonable. So you need to go to the Bible to find out the necessary information to reconstruct it. And looking at it the other way, if you start from the Bible, you only get the beginning of the story. Right. God has given us the ability to read the rocks and fill in the rest of the story. And we need to fully understand the flood. We start with the Bible, but then we go to the rocks. Speak to the rocks and they shall tell me what has happened in the past.
Kurt made a good point. The Bible records historical events, but it doesn't explain how those events happened. That's what these scientists were doing. They were trying to interpret the happenings in light of biblical history. Kurt said there was evidence inside the rocks. What was that evidence?
For me, as a paleontologist, it's like a chance to go to a zoo. So all the animals that used to live before the flood, like a chance to step back in time.
As long as they're alive.
And they don't smell. So that's pretty good. The Natural History Museum isn't just about telling us what was there. It's also trying to give us a storyline, right? And we've got two possibilities. We've got these two paradigms between a naturalistic view and a biblical view. All the natural history museums in the country and also around the world will give you just one of those views, only giving you the naturalistic older view of the world. But the same data, this dinosaur, is able to be understood in an alternate paradigm. So when I'm thinking about these types of creatures, I'm thinking about a world that's right before the flood.
I mean, this is a real picture of a violent world.
Yeah. That's why God said, behold, the end of all flesh. It wasn't just mankind. Man and all of the animals over which we rule are judged at the time of the flood.
Well, Marcus, can you kind of give us an overall picture of the fossils and how all this stuff fits together?
Yeah, fossils tend to be found in distinct layers where there are very, very large numbers that have been destroyed, untold billions. And so every time we see a layer of rock that's this thick, we're thinking about an event that probably took minutes, not thousands of years, minutes for just this one package of rock, but in seconds. Now, with these pulses of water from the flood are moving over the continent, grabbing the systems or dragging marine ones up from deeper in the ocean and pulling them onto land. And as one gets deposited and the waves come back, they start pulling and piling additional stuff on top of that. And it's a graveyard on top of a graveyard on top of a graveyard. It's the sort of thing that's catastrophe, sort of thing where the fossil record is gradually accumulating bone by bone, shell by shell, little by little, over untold eons of time.
So you're saying that we have these marine fossils all over, even on mountains?
Yeah, further back over in the museum, they've got sections with things like mosasaurs, these big swimming reptiles. Mosasaurs are globally distributed, and they're distributed on continents. So looking at these things, you're saying, what is it that has the power? What is it that has the capacity to take the marine world and throw it on top of the continents in such a violent and destructive manner? And the flood makes perfect sense for this.
When we were in the Grand Canyon, we saw that great unconformity, and there were no fossils to speak of really below that. And then all of a sudden, we start getting a lot. What does that say to you as a paleontologist?
Well, the great unconformity is telling me that there's some sort of massive erosion and shearing that's happening across the continent. And then once we start getting to those nice sedimentary rocks that have all the wonderful fossils in them, the pattern starts to emerge. The ecosystem that has the first animals in it shows up very suddenly. In conventional paleontology, they call this the Cambrian explosion. It's the first appearance of a wide diversity of different types of marine animals. All of a sudden, you have this complex and whole ecosystem that shows up basically out of nowhere. Now, that makes perfect sense from a creation and flood perspective because the flood is about destroying ecosystems. Whereas in an evolutionary view, these ecosystems are going to have to arise a little bit more gradually as organisms diversify and evolve and respond to one another in their environment. But that's not what you see. Instead, you see an explosion of life that is complex, whole. The ecosystem is integrated with one another. You can see where all the different organisms fit with respect to one another. And that's just the first time that that happens. Every time you move up in the geological column in this fossil record, you start seeing snapshots of more and more ecosystems. You've got one ecosystem that's destroyed, and then you've got another one. It's got slightly different creatures. There's different interactions going on. And as the floodwaters move higher and higher, they're getting closer and closer to shore, destroying more and more organisms in the shoreline and eventually up onto land.
Yeah. So I think I see what you're saying here, and that is that the paradigm that we're all taught, that conventional paradigm, is trying to tell us that the fossil record is an evolutionary picture of life as it is developing, as opposed to the Genesis paradigm that's saying, no, all of that life, all the complexity of life already was there, and now we're looking at the graveyard of all that life.
Exactly.
Well, what are some of the other data that you're seeing that convinces you of this paradigm?
Sure. Well, one very curious situation with the fossil record, so thinking vertically about things, is not the hard parts of the animal, but the trackways. They're the footprints. This is a pattern that we see in several different groups where their footprints are first and their body parts are later. For the trilobites, for the amphibians, for the dinosaurs, the first time I find evidence of them in the fossil record is from trackways, not the hard parts. From an old Earth perspective, that's really weird and hard to grapple with because you have millions of years between the trackway production and ultimately the animal that made it. That obviously doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Right? Because if there's trackways, there's animals, and those animals have bones and teeth and shells to them. Why aren't they fossilized? Instead, the pattern is telling us something different. There's no time between when somebody leaves a track and when somebody gets buried.
But the fact that those trackways are still there, that should tell us something as well, shouldn't it?
One, it tells us that the deposition or the placement of the next layer on top of them had to happen very, very quickly. Because, again, you go out onto a beach and you walk in the sand, your trackways are destroyed very, very quickly. But the fossil record is showing us something very different from today. this is death in a moment. Right? This is death in an instant. And we're talking about a world that was complex, whole, integrated, and the flood is destroying that world sequentially and burying it in a vertical fashion. And so I think looking at the fossil record as a record of life is partly correct, but it's not about life's development. It's about life's attempt to survive an event that ultimately consumed all.
That would make sense then, because when God was talking about destroying the earth with the flood, it wasn't just the destruction of human life, it was the destruction of all life. And so now the world we live in is, as you said, radically different than what that was before.
Yeah. When we look at the T-Rex, when we look at the mosasaurs, when we look at all these animals as ferocious carnivores, and they really are, they're terrifying, but that's not what they were initially created to be. And so these sharp teeth, these devastating claws, and the behaviors that go along with them all seem to be part of the curse. And part of that is genetic, part of it may also be some modifications. These organisms, by the time we see them, and this is important for us to remember when we come to a natural history museum, is you're not seeing the world at creation week.
Right.
You're seeing the world as it existed at the flood. And that world was one that was filled with violence and was a pretty terrible place to be.
I realized that the billions of creatures buried in those layers are a silent testimony to God's global judgment. I decided I wanted to see one of those layers of fossils for myself.
All right, you guys there? Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Sir.
All right. Tell me about track waves. What is he telling us?
About just actually they was not fossils, but they were it's tracks from animals, but they didn't have the body present at that time. It was just the tracks of different animals that revolved before the flood.
Okay. If you, like he said, he illustrated, walk down the beach up close to the water, you're going to leave tracks in the sand. How long is that track going to be there?
Not long.
Not long, because it's going to be either walked over by somebody else or the wave's going to come in and wash it out. For something to become fossilized, something, a dynamic process has to be taking place. Intense heat, intense weight, those tracks, in order for them to be fossilized, and they were fossils, and if you follow the track, typically they say you'll end up at a dead body. You'll find the bones as well. So the tracks and the bones were fossilized at the same time. That's what he's saying. The evolutionist says that those tracks, where they're found in the fossil record, they have to be billions and billions of years old, but those animals didn't live at that time. So this is one of the things that causes the evolutionist to scratch his head. How can those tracks be in that time frame that's billions and billions of years old? Because there should be no track. There should be no animal like that in that strata, but they are there. And so what he's saying is that it happened by a catastrophe. You take a animal running in fear for his life because maybe a tidal wave, maybe a volcanic explosion or whatever, and he's running and running. He's leaving tracks as he runs, and then all of a sudden, boom, that 10-ton of volcanic ash lands on him and his tracks and fossilizes them almost immediately. They're there, they turn them into stone, essentially. That's how we get that fossil record, and that's how that fossil record ends up being in a time frame that the evolutionists can't figure out. I think that's the idea that I get from that. That the fossil record is in denial of what evolutionists say. Evolutionists want the fossil record to say that there's this kind of fossil that's found in this layer because this layer is billions of years old, and therefore this animal is billions of years old. But then they find a fossil of an animal that lived maybe 10,000 years ago, but it's in the 2 billion year old strata. How did that happen? Well, they have no explanation. I do, or the Bible does. It was a flood. The fountains of the earth were broken up and everything was chaotic, and fossilization took place in lots of things in lots of ways during that time. All right, he's going to talk about fossils again in the next segment. Imagine heavy vehicles that don't have great tires in a muddy swamp. What's going to happen? If you take your Dodge truck or whatever out into a muddy swamp where it's been raining, it's been very, very wet for a few days, and you drive out there and you just have standard tires on that truck, what's going to happen?
It's gonna sink.
You're going to get stuck. I mean, you're going to sink, you're going to get stuck. And if you get stuck, then what? Well, you got to have somebody pull you out. If a deluge takes place, if a flood comes while you're stuck, what's going to happen?
You're probably going to dry, yeah.
You're going to die. Well, imagine a 10-ton animal doing that very thing, or several 10-ton animals doing that very thing. They're running in fear for their lives, but they run out into a muddy swamp because it's been raining for, it's going to be raining for 40 days and 40 nights. I don't know at what point they're running, if it's the first 10 days or whatever. It's constantly raining, a downpour of all downpours, and it's doing that for 40 days and 40 nights. The animals are running for shelter. They're running for high ground. They run into a muddy field and they get stuck. What's going to happen? Well, the water's going to rise, the floods are going to come, and it's going to capture them and kill them. And they're going to be stuck in that muddy field forever, dead. And if volcanic ash or whatever falls on top of them, they're going to be fossilized in that. Well, that's a little bit what he's going to talk about here. That's why we find so many dinosaur bones in one area. They're all headed for high ground. All these animals are running from the flood, so to speak. They're running from an earthquake or running from a blown up volcano. They're trying to find high ground and shelter, and that's why you find mass bodies of boneyards in certain places. I'll let him tell the story. I'm going to let it play two segments this time. There's another segment that is probably the most interesting to me on the whole video, and that's the one about soft tissue. Listen to what he's saying about soft tissue and help me understand it, or at least explain it to me when we get to that, okay? That'll be in the second segment. I'm going to play two segments here, and the first one is about bones being found in a muddy field, and the second one he's going to talk about soft tissue. I'll get it going. Can you hear the video okay?
Yes, sir.
All right, here we go.
The dinosaurs had died suddenly in the flood. Wouldn't it be obvious?
What we're dealing with here, this is in the Lance Formation. This is a Upper Cretaceous sedimentary deposit. And what we have here is what's called a bone bed. It's an accumulation of bones that's about a meter thick, a little less than a meter. And in this meter, we find the bones present as a graded bed with little bones at the top and the bigger bones at the bottom. And you can see here, it looks like Kirlinie is working on another vertebra here. This is a cervical vertebra of a duck-billed dinosaur. This is where the spinal cord goes right there. When I look at these bones in the quarry, I often think of them as being inside the animal alive, and just imagine what it's like to be seeing these bones for the first time. So this is just full of bones, and it's not like we have to go looking for where the bones are. We just have to sit down and start digging.
What is mainly different about the sites that you're digging here as opposed to what we would say a general dinosaur dig somewhere?
Well, there are dinosaurs found all over the world, but this particular site is unique in that it's probably one of the largest collections of bones in the world. And there are the remains of between 5 and 10,000 animals, each 20 to 40 feet long in this deposit. These are big animals, and there are a lot of them.
let's step back for just a second. Okay, so we had a duck-bill dinosaur roaming around the earth, and all of a sudden it dies. Would it become a fossil?
Fossilization requires very special circumstances. Normally, we know, for example, if a coyote dies out in the desert, his body is soon gone. Yet these bones are all perfectly preserved. They have never been subjected to weather. They're just all there. Today it would be very difficult to imagine how you could do that.
To some extent, we would really say that to find a fossil is rare. Even though we have many, many fossils, in terms of things that die, it's
Right.
rare if they become fossilized.
It is rare. It requires special circumstances, not the least of which is rapid burial. These animals had to die, and then their carcasses had to have time to rot. So we're talking days or weeks or months, during which time the bones and tissues were either eaten away or rotted away. And then the bones that remained were deposited instantaneously in this environment, because they're in a graded bed with big bones at the bottom and little bones at the top. And you can see that here. The big bones are all down at the bottom. And when they start digging up here, they start to find smaller bones. So that condition requires a sorting process that can only take place during a catastrophic emplacement.
So when we look at the dinosaur fossils, rather than looking at them from the standpoint of we have early dinosaurs, then middle dinosaurs, and later dinosaurs, you're looking at from the perspective that all those dinosaurs were in existence. They were all living, and then there was this huge catastrophe that brought them to an end.
The dinosaurs are already dinosaurs when they first appeared. They look just like anyone would think a dinosaur looked. And this is an enigma for those who believe in evolution of the dinosaurs.
But we hear a lot about transitional forms. What's the real story there?
Scientists have been able to lay out some forms they think are transitional, and some of them are very interesting, some even challenging. But they are the exceptions to the rule. The rule is there are no transitional fossils, and what we find in the fossil record, and contra to Darwin's hopes, this is the rule, is that a form exists in the fossil record. It basically stays unchanged, and it disappears from the fossil record without having been changed. That's got to mean something besides evolution, because we don't ever see changes from this form into this form in the rocks themselves. So it's coming from somewhere else. It's a paradigm that's being imposed on the data rather than the data providing the paradigm. So I think it's very easy for me to be a creationist just based on my understanding of the complexity of life forms. And when we look at the fossil record, we can see that complexity is all there from the beginning. And this begs the question of where did all this complexity come from? It's one thing to have faith. I have faith that God is the creator, but that's substantiated by what I see around me. To say I have faith that evolution produced this when I can't even see how it could have happened, that's blind faith.
That's a leap in the dark.
That's a leap in the dark.
It seemed that everywhere I looked, there was a growing body of evidence that fit the historical record of Genesis. It wasn't just one thing, it was many things pointing in the same direction. When I was with Mark, he told me about some recent discoveries of material inside dinosaur bones. So I traveled to a lab in Arizona to talk to a scientist who was doing some of that research himself.
This is a fragment of a Triceratops horn. When we pulled it out of the ground, it fragmented, and then, of course, we had to continue to fragment it in order to do analysis of it. In 2012, the Creation Research Society sponsored Mark Armitage and I to go to the Hell Creek Formation in Montana, which is a very popular place for finding dinosaur bones. And we instead dug out a almost 4-foot-long Triceratops brow horn. Now, it's just in crumbled pieces now, so we can't really, put it together and show you a horn. But yeah, you have to recognize that pieces such as this, we have found tissue with cells.
Oh, that's amazing.
And potentially proteins such as collagen. It's so difficult to understand how you could have this material still in a dinosaur fossil that is supposed to be 65, 75, 80 million years of age, because tissue, cells, proteins break down. They're not concrete. They don't just exist for eons of time. They break down. And in fact, they tend to break down fairly quickly depending upon the conditions. And certainly in Hell Creek, the conditions would be warm up, cool down, warm up, cool down. And any biochemist can tell you that is the fastest way to destroy material. It's difficult enough to envision it surviving for 4,000 or 5,000 years, but 60 million years, 70 million years, see, that really becomes very difficult to make any kind of biochemical basis for how it could have survived.
Okay, so once you find a sample like this, what do you do next?
So what we do is we soak the fossil material in a solution called EDTA. And what you'll have after you dissolve the fossil is the tissue will be remaining, because the EDTA won't dissolve the tissue. So then I'll bring this over to what we call a dissection microscope. This is, in essence, dissolved Triceratops horn magnified. And so you can see what it looks like, just kind of little pieces of rock.
Well, Kevin, what did you find then when you were looking at the sample and you actually found some tissue?
Okay, here's what we found. This is actually Triceratops tissue. It's stretchable, it's pliable, it's not an impression of the soft parts of the dinosaur. This is truly soft, it is squishy, it is stretchable, it is tissue.
That blows your mind, huh?
Absolutely. And if you look at them then at a closer magnification, what we see then, this is using scanning electron microscopy, you see the extreme detail of the cells. See in that picture, and this picture, and particularly like look at this picture, we would not begin to expect to see such enormous and elaborate detail. I mean, these structures are incredibly small. You know, this is our 20 micron bar here. See how small these structures are, still intact. It would take very little to break those. So at best, you would expect that all that would have broken off and been long gone.
So that has to have shaken up the scientific community. What's been the response of all of this?
The initial response, when Dr. Schweitzer first published her work, which is what became very popularized in 2005, it generated a lot of response. And so initially, some of the reaction was rejection. Oh, it's contamination. You know, that's not really dinosaur, and it's bacteria, because bacteria can look kind of strange sometimes. So you had a lot of proposals of what it could be. And to her credit, Dr. Schweitzer did more work. They began to find protein. You break open some of these cells. You look at the matrix these cells are attached to, and they're protein.
Okay, so once that is understood,
yes,
then what happens? Now this is shaking it up, I guess.
That becomes part of the controversy, because clearly you're now faced with how could you explain the survival of this, the pristine survival of this, not only for so long, but in very unpristine conditions. And so then the controversy has been, how do you explain it? And if you read some of the literature, there's almost like desperation of, because they recognized what the implications of this could be. Now, some people would claim, well, it means nothing because we know how old they are, and therefore it just means it survives somehow, big deal. But how do you know how old they are? Well, you use supposed methods of dating. Well, this is a method of dating. The tissue itself can't be discounted as part of a method of dating. So why do you say that doesn't count, but this does count? Well, it's all the paradigm drives your conclusions. The paradigm is it has to be old. Therefore, methods that give us an old fossil are what we choose. Something that doesn't give us an old fossil, like tissue, we have to reject or explain away.
At least to me, and of course, I'm not a microbiologist, but I think most people would say, well, that just seems reasonable to think that maybe these are not that old.
Clearly, this is in violation of the dating process. It challenges the entire dating process. If the fossils of dinosaurs have been dated incorrectly, which I would say this is clear evidence they have, then it's very likely the fossils of any organism have dated incorrectly, and therefore then the geologic ages themselves are incorrect.
What you're saying is that if you pull out the notion of a long period of time, you're pulling out a major foundation for the conventional paradigm.
Absolutely. In fact, time is the critical component for evolution. If you're going to say that a simple cellular system became a multicellular system that then became fish, and the fish then jumped up on land and grew legs and started breathing air, and then that creature grew feathers and wings, started flying. So if you give us time, we'll claim to account for all of this massive change of organisms, but we got to have the time.
Everything seemed to come back to the question of time. I remembered Andrew saying that Charles.
All right. Let me write down that time. You guys there?
I'm here.
Tell me about soft tissue. What do you know about soft tissue?
It can determine time.
Say it again.
It can determine time.
Okay. How so?
Once they put the evidence under the microscope, they can kind of tell whether or not they were billions of years old or hundreds of years old.
Right. What he's saying is the evolutionist says the Triceratops, for example, lived 65 million years ago. He died, went extinct, whatever happened to him. We have his fossilized bones. No one expects to find in a 65 million year old bone any kind of soft tissue. You think about a chicken bone. When you eat that chicken, and I don't know if you're the type that does. When I used to live in Russia, they did. They'd break those bones open and they'd suck out the whatever's inside that bone. That's that soft tissue. I don't care for it, but some people do. You expect to find that soft tissue in there when you cook that chicken and began eating it. But if you found a chicken bone out in the desert that's been there for a few years, you wouldn't expect anything soft in there, would you? It's all dried up. It's the elements have taken care of it. Well, that would be the same case with this Triceratops. There should be nothing left inside. It should have all turned to stone or turned to fossil, but yet we find when you crack him open, at least in some cases, in this particular case, there was soft tissue. That immediately says this bone is not 65 million years old. This fossil is not 65 million years old. It's much, much, much younger. I mean, it has to be within the hundreds or thousands of years old. And if you go back to the flood, you're looking at, from our time back to the flood, 2,000, 4,000, around 4,000, 5,000 years. I'm surprised that soft tissue in those dried up or fossilized bones lasted that long, but it has. It's there. I'm no scientist, so I can't explain how it did. But the fact that it's there tells you this cannot be 65 million years old as they date the Triceratops extinction. So to me, it's just a nail in the coffin of evolution. Now they, as he said, deny it and so forth, but it is what it is, and they can't deny the fact. Well, they can, but they have no valid denial of the facts. In the next section, he's going to talk about DNA. What is DNA? You've heard a lot about that in our lifetime. What is DNA? You get 5 extra points if you can spell it. Not the DNA, but the word that it stands for.
It's your molecular makeup. It determines how you see, how you look, how your skin is. It just determines how you are as a person. Color of your eyes.
Your mic went out.
How about that?
You're back.
All right. DNA affects every living organism. And from this video, I'd have to do more research to say this is a matter of fact. I'm giving you this video as these men are professors and scientists in their own right. I can't say they're absolutely right because I don't know them. I haven't tested the facts myself. I have to trust them because, well, I don't know how. But they told me in this video some things about DNA that I was not aware, that it has a, I don't think they use this word, but a morphing ability that can cause our bodies, our human bodies, not only our human bodies, but other animals as well, to do different things in different circumstances. And I want you to pay attention to what he says about that because it has a lot of, it's got a lot of information. And I think it's really good for you to have in the back of your head as you learn the book of Genesis and you begin to talk to people about evolution, because you're going to, everybody believes evolution nowadays. And it's not because they hate the Bible. It's just that they've grown up being taught evolution. And so you're going to have to unteach them. I remember in Russia teaching a lady the gospel, and she was at a point where she should be asking to be baptized, but she wasn't. Rather, she was crying. And met with her for a few weeks, and she was just bawling. And I asked her name's Svetlana. I said, Svetlana, what's wrong? And she said, well, I see what you're saying, and I see it's absolutely true, but what do I do? I've taught all these people. She was a teacher in school, a science teacher and a math teacher in school. I've taught all these girls, all these young people throughout these years of my life that evolution is true and there is no God. And here I find out I've been wrong all that time. What do I do? She didn't feel comfortable becoming a Christian because of all that she had taught people prior. Well, we did baptize her and helped her understand her poor reasoning there. But my point is, everybody you meet as a evangelistic prospect, they've been taught evolution just like you have. Maybe you didn't believe it, but in the science class in 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade, and so forth, they're taught evolution. When you come to college or go to college, you're going to get a heavier dose of it. You're going to get it from a philosophical point of view. All right, so let's look at it, what he says to say about DNA. Let me see if I'm going to... yeah, I'll just let the next two segments run together. I won't stop between this segment and the next segment, but I will stop it after that. All right, so I'll let the next two segments go. Pay attention to what he has to say about DNA. Let me get that other microphone going.
Darwin accepted millions of years first, then fit his theory of evolution to that assumption. Why is time such an important element in evolution? Rob Carter is a marine biologist, so he took me scuba diving to get a glimpse of the world most people don't see, especially what's cool. I know a lot about the incredible creatures that inhabit the reefs around St. Louis. Oh man, we got the sharks here. I mean, just look how they move, and it's almost like effortlessly glide along. I wish I could swim like that.
Engineers wish we could make boats like that.
Yeah.
Submarines that could move as efficiently as a shark. We can't quite do it.
So, from your perspective as a marine biologist, and I know that you've studied the whole area of genetics a lot.
Yes.
When people talk about evolution, what is it?
How do you define evolution? The word means change over time. But I believe in change over time, but I'm not an evolutionist. So how does one figure this out? Really, evolution is a belief that enough change over enough time, can lead to the common ancestry of all species on Earth.
All right.
So that's the part I reject. Of course, species change. I mean, look at these sharks here. We have several different species of sharks. When God created, he put into those organisms the ability to change, to adapt, to respond dynamically to the environment. But they're still sharks. And when we look at the fossil record, they're still sharks. You know, people have heard the phrase the missing link, and they usually think of between man and monkeys. No, there's missing links between almost every major group of animal and almost every other major group of animal and plant, even bacteria, throughout the entire fossil record, which indicates very strongly that these are actually different creations.
So we don't get one kind becoming another kind.
No. Evolutionary theory requires that small, random changes can explain everything we see. But it can't.
And why can't it?
Because life is so complex that small changes can't explain it. Just like you can't take a computer operating system and look at it and say, oh yeah, this is built up one digit at a time over any length of time. No, it took an intelligent person to sit down and put it together.
Well, I can guarantee you, as one who was in that world, that if anyone in the area of computer science were to say, if we just randomly change some things in this operating system, it'll get better. I mean, no one would agree with that.
No, we're not going to get the shark to evolve into a bird. The number of changes and the types of changes are not something that you can do one change at a time. This is a sea urchin.
Looks spiny.
Yeah, it's pointy. You gotta be careful.
Am I gonna get stuck on my tongue?
No. He's pointy, but
Oh my goodness, they're moving.
yes, they're moving. And in between the spines are little tube feet, especially on the bottom. Oh, look at that movement. So he walks with his spines, but he's little tube feet in here, and that's what he uses to grab onto things. But looking carefully, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There are actually 10 radial parts to this animal. Actually, the starfish is his cousin.
Are you serious? You can't be serious.
Absolutely. Starfish here is also an echinoderm, but notice he has 5-fold symmetry instead of 10.
Yeah.
This starfish does. On the bottom, look. We see the spines, we see the tube feet. His mouth is in the center there.
So there is some similarity here, even
Similarity
though externally it looks a lot different.
A lot different. Actually, you want to see something that looks a lot different?
Sure.
Which is a cousin to the starfish and the sea urchin?
All right. It almost looks like a rock.
Yes. I gotta be careful. He's squirting on me. This is a sea cucumber. He has spines. He has 2 feet.
Oh my goodness.
You would never know it until you studied really hard that this also is an echinoderm. He's not very happy being out of the water, so let me put him back in.
Yeah, so these are all related, even though they look very, very different.
Related in their creation. Not in an evolutionary sense, but our creator took this phylum of life, the echinoderms, and created this and this and this on a similar pattern. So that's what we see across the entire realm of life, similarities and differences.
So what makes them different?
Well, genetically, they share most of their genes in common, but there are developmental genes. They're called Hox genes that set up these patterns in the animal as it develops. They develop from a single cell. Then in one of them, they set up a 5-fold symmetry. Another, they set up a 10-fold symmetry. Another one, they make this long, skinny animal. They control the development of the embryo in these amazing ways.
So what you're saying, when we look at this from a molecular or genetic perspective, what we're finding is really a fascinating design in all of that.
Absolutely.
But what we've heard in the conventional paradigm, the conventional story tells us that it's those random changes that has brought about all of this.
Sure. Back in the 1800s, when life was simple, when they didn't know what was happening inside the cell, they didn't know how complex genetics was, you can imagine all sorts of things. But now that we know what actually happens behind the scenes, the story gets a lot more complicated. You see, I like to say the genome is 4-dimensional. What we have a one-dimensional string called DNA. And if you want to draw that out, you have to write all the letters of DNA out on all 3 billion of them. And then you have to draw lines or arrows from one part to another part, because this part turns this part off, this part interferes with this part enhances this. It's this huge two-dimensional interaction network. That's where you have a two-dimensional genome.
I mean, let me stop you for a second, because this is really amazing to think about this, because I think in terms of a computer program that is fairly static. I mean, the instructions are there, but you're talking about a program that is reprogramming itself. It's modifying its own instructions.
Wait till I get to the fourth dimension.
Oh, okay.
Because the third dimension first. The information in that first dimension, that linear string, has to be organized in such a way that when it falls into the third dimension, it still works.
Well, that's amazing.
Genes that are used together are next to each other in 3D space.
Are you saying that once this thing gets folded up, it's almost like we have a new set of instructions?
Yes, a new level of information.
Unbelievable.
That whoever programmed that first level needed to understand what was going to happen, have it work in the third level.
But you said there's another dimension.
Oh yeah, the fourth dimension is time.
And how does that work?
The genome changes shape over time. Maybe you eat something that's bad for you, and your liver says, I can get rid of that toxin. Now, the chromosomes in the liver will change shape, expose that new protein gene, make copies of it, build a brand new protein that can kill off that toxin, and when it's not needed anymore, they'll change shape again and fold back.
Oh my goodness.
Dynamic programming. All 3 levels change in the fourth level, time.
Rob, that's so far beyond anything that we know, even in our most complex software systems, that it's almost beyond imagination to think that someone would look at that and say it all happened by chance.
Yes, and it only brings glory to God.
It does.
You can't build something like that up one thing at a time. You need it to function. In all this interlocking 4-dimensional complexity, it's not something you can do one letter at a time with natural selection.
It all has to be there.
Yeah, in the same way when we talk about the environment out here on the coral reef, if you don't have all these interlocking pieces of that puzzle, you don't have that ecology. The system will come crashing down if you just remove a couple of very important factors that are there. They have to be together or it doesn't happen.
So not only did we have this interdependency, this mutualism, so to speak, down at the genetic level, now we even make it more complex by saying there is that same mutualism at the higher level.
Yes, in fact, the entire world has a mutualism.
It's impossible to think that all of this could have happened just by a series of slow processes over billions of years.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
It's clear that the world we live in is incredibly interdependent, from the smallest biological system to the largest ecosystem. There are complex mutual relationships everywhere. I realize that creation in 6 days makes the most sense from an engineering perspective. You need everything working together at the same time for everything to function properly. And that's exactly how Genesis says God created it. Rob also said God created animals with the ability to change and adapt to their environment. Is it possible that this ability to change has been mistaken for evolution? Scott Wood and I walked through the zoo, saw incredible beauty and amazing design wherever we looked. It looks great diversity between some animals, as well as a remarkable similarity of others. As a biologist, what do you see when you see all of these creatures?
Yeah, when I look at this, these lions specifically, I'm seeing cats myself, and all the other cats they have here at the zoo, they all have this underlying catness to them that's really apparent. It's really apparent when they start playing, right? You're seeing them playing with some sort of ball or something, and they're
just like a cat.
They look like a cat. You know, scientists would put that into a family called Felidae, and I would understand the felids to be representatives of a single created kind. So the continuity, the similarity there is so significant that I'd say, yeah, these guys have all descended from a single pair of critters that was on the ark, and that eventually generated all the different sorts of cats that we have today.
So rather than just a random accident, it appears as if all of these different species are coming from a really elaborate design.
Oh, absolutely. And it's not just a design like God, designed and created the lion. It's God created something that could make a lion. So it's more like, a multi-tool or a Swiss Army knife where you got all these pieces that you can just pop out whenever you need them, but it's all just one thing.
So give me some other examples of created kinds.
Yeah, so you got the grizzlies and polar bear. Those are all members of the bear kind. You've got ducks, swans, and geese. The thing about the dog kind is really interesting. So you take just this wolf-like creature, and we can breed in only a few hundred years many different breeds.
Well, Todd, that's kind of fascinating now to think about what God was doing when he was bringing two of every kind. What do you think was going on there?
Oh, yeah. I mean, he doesn't have to bring every little variety onto the ark. So when you actually do the calculations, and okay, so we don't know exactly how many created kinds there were on the ark, but maybe a couple thousand, and they're small. Most animals are quite small, so you have room to spare, literally room to spare. And all of that diversity that we have today is built into those two of every kind.
Well, Todd, we're looking at the zebras, and they're all unique, and yet all of these creatures, there's just so much complexity and diversity. How does the standard story, the conventional paradigm, explain all of that?
Well, they would use evolution, right? So billions of years, random variations, all things that are alive now, that cactus, that zebra, the grass here, it's all related. We all go back to a common ancestor that lived billions of years ago. And through the process of mutation and genetic variation and natural selection, that's where we get the stuff that we have today.
So, natural selection, what is it? Does it have the kind of creative potential that we need for all of this?
Natural selection is basically all about killing off things that aren't fit for the environment. So if you're a finch in the Galapagos and you have a really tiny beak and the only food available to you is really big hard seeds, you're going to die. And that's exactly what we observe. And so we can watch over the generations as the beak size and finches change in the Galapagos. But they're still finches, they're still birds. The notion that natural selection can generate all of the diversity we see, that's not been demonstrated. What we find most often with natural selection is that natural selection does a lot of fine tuning. So right over here, we've got these oryxes, right? Beautiful creatures and very, very pale colors. The wild range of the oryx is right on the southern end of the Sahara Desert. And so you can see, yeah, the coloration makes sense. If you get a really dark colored one, that's going to be really easy for predators to find. And so they end up being these really beautiful light colors. And that's an example of where selection would take a variation and turn it into an adaptation.
And that brings us back to the notion that a really exquisite design in the beginning
Absolutely.
has provided these creatures with the ability to survive and to change for their benefit.
Absolutely. So the ability to be able to change your coloration like that, to be able to fit an environment, that's got to be built into the system before it starts. Now, don't get me wrong. I mean, natural selection and random variation can do amazing things. I mean, it's pretty astonishing the kinds of changes that we can see. But we don't see one kind changing into another. All we see are variations that happen within a created kind. So there's a felid tree, which has all the cats on it. There's the canid tree, which has all the dogs on it. There's the ursid tree, which has all the bears on it. There's the equid tree with all the horses on it. Each individual created kind then has its own individual tree, so that you end up with something like an orchard or a forest.
As a scientist, it seems what you're saying is that the Genesis paradigm answers all of this data better.
Ultimately, I think it does, because it embraces both similarity and difference. Now, as we've already said, there's lots of questions that are still out there, but I'm pretty confident, given what our paradigm can explain, I'm very confident that those answers are going to be found.
After we left the zebras, we made our way to the gorillas. Todd wanted to talk about the question of human evolution. Todd, we see it all the time, a new discovery, new skulls, new skeletons that supposedly solidify this whole link.
Yeah.
What do you see there?
Absolutely. Well, I got some right here in my bag.
Ooh, a skull.
So this guy is a Neanderthal, very, very low forehead. So we have really tall foreheads. The face, the mid face has been pulled out. But at the same time, well, it looks very human. So that's Neanderthal. You want to hold that one for me?
Yeah.
Okay. We have others that are very different.
Oh, yeah.
Now this one is Australopithecus africanus. So you can see really no forehead at all. It just slopes right back. Very, very small brain case. Muzzle sticks way out. So the face is sloped forward. What do you do with this stuff? I mean, there's many more that we could show, many more pictures, many more skulls, and you can see looking at them together, there's a lot of difference there.
Yeah.
Well, here's the thing. So all that created kind stuff that we already talked about, I can show again and again and again with multiple studies that I can find a discontinuity between humans and non-humans. So this thing lands on the human side. This Neanderthal here, it's one of us. This thing is not. It is different. But this would be just another one of those varieties of living things that God made in the beginning and that survived the flood aboard the ark.
So when we look at Neanderthal man, we're looking at a human, but it's a human that just like we find in dogs, we have a lot of variety of dogs.
We got a lot of variety of people. So even looking back here at the gorilla, we can see the obvious differences between us and him, not the least of which is that he's in there and we can go home when we're done.
And so those differences are really huge, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. The image of God entails this idea of being God's representative here on this earth. Part of that then is having dominion and having authority, spiritual quality that we have that we don't share with animals like that.
It's obvious we're different from the rest of creation because we're made in God's image. We're the only ones to create zoos so we can see the beauty of God's animals. And we're unique in tracking time and wanting to know our own history. But where does our concept of time come from?
Okay, you guys still awake?
Yes, we are.
All right.
Yes.
What do you get from that? There's a whole lot of information there, I know. Give me what you.
Well, there's different groups. What he boiled down to was the difference between what God has made is he made a group, but from a single one of the group, there was two of the kind that, of course, went on the ark, and from that revolved just in that group. Their diversity is still the same group, but their diversity changed maybe in their color or size or something like that. But it was in that still same group, and the end portion of that is, we didn't revolve from a monkey or ape because of he gave the cranium and looked at the cranium at that point to give us a description of our cranium. But he gave of course, like everything else, the kind. And from those kind, they only produce of their kind.
That's right.
And that was the production of it.
That's right. You can't cross over from dog to cat. The evolutionary paradigm says it has to happen, but they can't find an example of it. And the creation paradigm explains it fully. It's like you said, you got two cats that go on, two Bengal tigers that go on the ark, but from those two Bengal tigers can become all the different kinds of cats that are there, that are here today, because of the DNA ability to change and adapt. Vincent, you get anything from that?
Yes, sir. That's what I was going to speak on about the different variation, the adaptation that even though they had two of each, over a period of time, each animal adapted to their environment. So like with the bird, he was talking about the beak, at one time he could not reach the food with the short beak. Then over time, the beak got longer and he was able to adapt to that.
Right. It's just amazing what God has placed within the power of the DNA. And we didn't even know about DNA until the 1800s, and we didn't really fully know about it. They found it in the 1800s. I forget the exact date and the exact person, but they didn't know what to do with it then. It just sort of laid on the table. People were thinking about it and looking about it. But I think in the I read it today somewhere much later than the 1800s, we began to see the power and potential that the DNA strand has and how it's designed. And I guess the main thing I want you to see in this segment, and I guess the whole thing, is that there has to be a designer. If our computers today can do what they do, and they're not nearly as complex as one strand of DNA, take the lowest life form on Earth and you take his DNA, the computer systems that we have today can't even get in the shadow of the potential or what that DNA can do. And yet God, evolutionists say, well, it just happened that way. It's just an accidental freak of nature that it happened that way. And it changed over billions of years, one step at a time, one adaptation at a time. And it's just not possible for that to be the case. All right, we're going to take a break for a few minutes. It's 6:30, 7:30, 7:41. Let's be back at 7:41. Let's say 7:50, and we'll finish up.
Okay.
All right.
I'm going to pause the recording. Find a way to pause the recording. All right, you guys back?
Yes, sir.
All right. This next segment, there's only a few more left, about 20 minutes, I guess, total left. It's on the stars. How important are the stars in trying to estimate or guesstimate the age of the Earth? Any ideas?
Well, I would guess the alignment.
I don't know if it's so much the alignment, Lawrence. If you think about how far they say the stars are away, that I can't give you a particular name, but let's say Pluto or whatever. No, not Pluto. It's a planet, or it's not even a planet anymore. But one of those stars in a different universe or different. They say they're so many millions of light years away, or thousands of light years away, or whatever the word they use there. What do they mean by that? 1,000 light years. or a million light years?
Distant. Distant.
It's distance, but how does that define distance? Think about the speed of light. What is that? I don't know. It's supposed to be really, really fast, right? Let's say the speed of light is 3,000 miles an hour. I don't know what it is. That's just a number I threw out there. And so if it takes an hour for light to travel 3,000 miles, how far will that light travel in 1,000 years? Well, if you can do the math, good for you. It'd be a long, long way, right? If it can go 3,000 miles an hour, how far will it go in 1,000 years? Well, that's a lot of miles, more miles than my computer in my head can compute. Well, they say, and it's true, that there are some stars, the light from which we are just now are able to see, and that star is, let's say, 2 million, I don't know what numbers they put on them, 2 million light years away. Why are we just now receiving that if it's if the creation module is true? If the creation module is true, we cannot see the light from a star that's 2 million miles away, because that would prove that the Earth is that many millions of years old. I don't know if that makes any sense to you or not. So how would you answer that? If the star being that distance away proves to the scientists that the Earth must have been here for that many years for the light to have gotten here at the speed of light, how do we answer that? What would be your answer? Do you have one? Because you weren't expecting the question, I don't expect you to necessarily pop one up real quick. Think about it like this. When God created the trees on day 4, I guess it was, or day 5, whatever day it was, God created trees. How old was that tree?
3 or 4 days old when he created.
When he created it, it was 1 day old. Whatever day it was, if he created it on day 3, the day he created it, it was 1 day old. Next day, it was 2 days old. But if you cut that tree down, or if you were to look at it from, just see it out there in the yard, how old would that tree look? It's a full-grown tree. It looks like it's 30 years old, 40 years old, 50 years old. Cut it down, it may have circles in it. I don't know. Same thing with a bear. If God had created a bear on the day 6, and you look at that bear, how old is that bear? Well, he looks like he's a full-grown bear. I expect he's 4 or 5 years old, maybe 10 years old. But he's only 1 day old when he created Adam. How old was Adam? Well, I don't know, but I figure he looked somewhere around the age of 25 or 30 years old. So what can we gain from that? God created things, the earth, to have an appearance of age. Even though it was only 1 day old or 1 week old, he created things to have the appearance of age. Well, why wouldn't he have done the same thing with the stars? The light from those stars was traveling at ever how many miles an hour light travels, but on the day that God created it, that light was most of the way here already. It's just the way when we got the light of the sun immediately, because it's not millions of light years away. So the appearance of age on that, we have light on the day that God created it, just a few seconds afterwards. So the star dating thing is not as big or scary an issue as some of the evolutionary scientists want to impose upon us. It's easily explained just by saying that God created things with the appearance of age. Adam wasn't created as a baby. He was created as a full-grown man, but he's only 1 day old. The tree wasn't created as a sapling. It was created as a full-grown tree so that they could eat fruit from it. But it was only 1 day old. And the same thing with the other things that God created. Let's listen to what he has to say about the stars. And then he's going to go into some of the ancient stargazers, and probably, in his opinion anyway, what was an ancient stargazing building. I'm not sure if it was. He may be going out on a limb on that, but it makes good sense what he says, and then we'll go from there. Let me start the video. You guys can hear me?
Yes, sir.
All right. Let's give her a go.
Danny took me far outside the city and kept me up very late in order to show me something I will never forget. Oh my goodness, now you're gonna make me buy a telescope.
We have some purposes given for the stars in Genesis 1:14-19. It's day 4. The stars, other have time, rule of the night, to be for signs, seasons, festivals, and so forth. People have been using the stars for marking passage of time. They have them repeat every night, every year. They come back in the season. There's a lot of regularity going on here.
What about the design of the sun and the moon?
Well, there are a couple of things I can talk about. On rare occasions, the moon passes between us and the sun. Not very often. And when that happens, the moon is barely cover the sun up. If the moon were a little smaller or a little farther away, it wouldn't do it at all. If it were larger or closer to us, it would be grossly overpotent. And so these eclipses are spectacular, rare, and this is the only planet on which it matters. It's the only planet that happens. And you've got to think either that's the way the world is for no apparent reason, or the world is that way for a purpose and design. Maybe that speaks of creation. Okay, high overhead here we have the Great Square of Pegasus. This is big rectangle. Now coming off of Pegasus is a little fuzzy spot right there. You see that? Yes. That's the Andromeda Galaxy. That is the most distant object that you can see with the naked eye. It's a little, we think, a little over 2 million light years away. It means a couple hundred billion miles away.
Okay, Danny, that brings me to a big question, and a big question in a lot of people's minds. If we have stars that are that far away, millions of light years away, and if the Earth is young, as we believe, then how in the world can the starlight be here?
Yeah, we call this the light travel time problem, and I'll try to phrase it for you a little differently. We believe that the creation is only thousands of years old. Say 6,000 years, 7,000 years, something like that. And I just pointed out something to you that we think is 2 million light years away from us. I think those distances are reasonably correct. And we creationists need to answer this question, and we've offered several different solutions to that. I'll discuss with you my solution on this. Several things jump out at me in the creation account. One, there was a lot of process going on, very rapid process, but still process. If you look at the day 3 account, it talks about plants rising up out of the ground. It says, let the earth bring forth these plants, and the earth brought forth. I think if you would have been there, it would have looked like a time-lapse movie. Growth that might take normally decades, taking place in a matter of minutes or hours at the most. Normal growth abnormally fast. I believe you can interpret one day of creation in terms of another day. So I turn to the day 4 account. Not much information is given there, but I think God also rapidly made the stars and other astronomical bodies. And then in order for them to fulfill their function to be seen, he had to rapidly bring forth that light, just as he brought plants and matured them quickly. He had to bring that light here. I'm suggesting we actually look at these objects like the Andromeda Galaxy itself. We're looking at light that actually left that object. So I think there's a rapid maturing that place.
Danny, are there some other things that you see that would point to a young universe?
I think so. For instance, spiral galaxies. The Andromeda Galaxy we talked about is a spiral galaxy. Our own is. And the inside of the galaxies should spin faster than the outside of the galaxy. So after a few rotations, you ought to wind up or smear out those spiral patterns. They ought to disappear after a few rotations. Now, most astronomers think that spiral galaxies are 10 billion years old. So why do we still see spiral patterns? You shouldn't see those. And it's been long recognized as a problem. But also, if we look at the outer planets of the solar system, the gas giants, they all have rings. And we also know that these things are changing. They're wiping out. They've actually documented changes that have taken place within the ring system. You have all these gravitational tugs from the other satellites orbiting around. So these ring systems are fairly young. It doesn't prove that the solar system is young, but it proves that these ring systems are young. And that's interesting.
We've mentioned a lot of theories about the spirals and so forth. It brings us to what most people see as the big theory concerning cosmology and the universe, and that's the Big Bang. How do you see that? Is it holding up over time?
I don't think so. I think it's getting some problems. So much so that more than a dozen years ago, I think in the New Scientist magazine, there was an open letter protesting the Big Bang theory, and it's had hundreds of signatories since. And most people signing it are atheists. They're not even creationists. So this idea that the Big Bang model is universally accepted is not true. There are many people out there, well-known people, very famous physics and astronomy people, that have real problems with the Big Bang. And I don't see any way that you can reconcile Big Bang with the Bible, though a lot of people seem to think that you can. I think the temptation they have there is to try to interpret scripture in terms of the current cosmological thinking. That's nothing new. That's happened before, as it's turned out, with disastrous results. So I think when you look at the history of science, the way we've discarded theories over time, we've had theories that were supposedly beyond dispute, and then later on discarded. When you see that lesson from history and then you want to wed Genesis, you want to interpret Genesis in terms of the ruling paradigm, I think you need to be very careful.
I realized Danny was reorienting our perspective. We need to interpret the universe in terms of Genesis, not the other way around. And Genesis tells us that God created the sun, moon, and stars to be a magnificent clock to track the passage of time. Even the ancients built towers to follow the stars. But what does Genesis say about those people and the languages they spoke? Doug took me to one of the best archaeological museums in the world to show me some of the unique artifacts that relate to Genesis.
Well, the events of the Bible are unfolded in the ancient Near East. So all of these lands are extremely important to understanding how and what took place in the biblical text.
So this picks up these events we've been looking at in Genesis, from creation and the flood, and now we're to the dispersion of mankind out of Noah and his family.
Exactly. And the dispersion would have taken place somewhere in this mountain range to the northwest of Mesopotamia. And what we see in the biblical text in the narrative is that a number of people have migrated down to southern Mesopotamia, the land of Shinar, and moved toward the process of urbanization, city living.
And that's the famous Tower of Babel.
Absolutely.
Do we know where that is?
There are about 7 or 8 Babels, cities of Babel, in the ancient area of Mesopotamia. And so one at a time, I've studied all of those areas and found only one that meets all the criteria of the famous site of the Tower of Babel, and that is the site of Eridu, which is in southeastern Mesopotamia. We have signs of the expansion to the north, to the south, to the east, to the west, all the way as far as Egypt.
And when you say evidence, that is the artifacts that we find in these archaeological digs?
Exactly. There's an enormous amount and very specific kinds of material culture that attest to this expansion of people that I'm connecting to the post-Babel dispersion. Here are the bevel rim bowls, these two, just that rimkin brick that we see up there, and those 2 spouted jars. All of these diagnostic forms of pottery and material culture, they're found throughout the Near East. The Bible describes an event that's not just the confusion of language, but it's the dispersing of people far from that city. And because we see language or the written expression of language just pop up out of nowhere, and then different languages being represented through cuneiform script or through hieroglyphic script or other means. So you do not have a universal plan that's followed among all of the languages. You see great diversity in the forms of grammar from language to language, even in ancient languages.
It seems then that the event recorded in Genesis about the Tower of Babel, that's a very, very critical event for archaeology.
It is. So all of this fits perfectly with what we would see as the biblical account of how languages took place. It's really the only way of explaining this. So the integrity of biblical history ultimately is justified by the expression of these languages.
Now, most of us think today of a tower, the kinds of things we see in big cities, big straight walls. Is that what they were building?
Well, essentially, it's a variation of a pyramid, and there were 4 sides to it and several stairways that would go up to the top. At Eridu, we have a temple that existed in 18 different phases, and every phase, it grew in its size and its complexity. And that final temple, that final phase of the temple, it was abandoned immediately, right at the time of the late Uruk expansion. Catacornered to the temple was an absolutely enormous platform.
Do you think that could be the foundation of the Tower of Babel?
Absolutely, and I would suggest to you that this late Uruk expansion, where this technology began, was something that spread with the people. We find forms of these ziggurats all around the globe. We find them in China, we find them in India, we find them in various parts of the Americas, we find them all over.
Well, obviously we have evidence here of civilization and people beginning to gather together in communities, even cities. Do we have any other evidence of that?
Absolutely. We can move forward to the time of Abraham, because we know that Abraham lived at the site of Ur, which was also in southern Mesopotamia, at the end of the 3rd millennium BC.
That brings us to the end of Genesis chapter 11.
Exactly. In fact, you see some pottery, some cuneiform tablets, all dating to the period of the 3rd dynasty of Ur.
It's amazing just as we're sitting here thinking about that, thinking about Abraham, and that this represents the culture and the civilization that he lived in. It's a great tie to that record in Genesis 4.
It is fascinating, and it gives you a feeling of putting your hands around the events that go on in the biblical text.
When I look back through history, I realized each of these cultures had been impacted by the events recorded in Genesis. But what is the importance of Genesis to us today?
All right, I'm going to let him go ahead and finish out the video. It take looks like about 10 minutes to finish it up. What do you think about the star dating? Anything new there for you, or is that something you're already aware of?
Somewhat aware of. The time distance. I'm still baffled about that. How they determine how many light years is what.
Well, how they determine it is by just figuring out the speed of light and then how far that star is. Then they say it's that many light years, and that's a definition that they have for that. But how that light got here, the guy on the video gave a theory that on day 3, God caused the trees to grow just very suddenly, and then they look like they're 30-year-old trees in one day. And then he says maybe God did the same thing on the stars, that he created them out there for their purpose, which their purpose is to be seen, and he caused their light to miraculously come forward quickly, just like he caused the trees to grow. I thought that's a pretty good idea.
Mm-hmm.
Whether or not it's true, science can't prove it, neither can we, but it makes a good sense.
Right.
To me, anyway.
Uh-huh.
This last segment that he did on the ziggurats, I thought that was interesting and comes straight out of Genesis, that Tower of Babel that we'll read about in chapters 10 and 11, where the languages begin. and how about that same time, according to the historical data, about that same time, we began to see the different languages emerge.
Right.
Interesting that what we find in history is also what we find in the Bible. I hope that you guys have enjoyed this video. I know I enjoyed it. I found it a few weeks ago, a few months ago, and I thought it was very, very beneficial, and I thought it would be a good part of our Genesis class. It gives us a good foundation. It doesn't add anything to our faith in the sense that we believe in God and we believe in what God's word says, but it gives us some scientific evidence and maybe some scientific theory that is supportive of what the Genesis account says, rather than what the scientists, the evolutionary scientists, tell us that it does not. There are two paradigms, and depending on whether you believe in God or not, is what paradigm you choose. But to choose a paradigm and maintain it when there's no evidence for it, when it's actually against the evidence, I think it makes you a fool. And I think that's what the people who believe in evolutionists or who are evolutionists make themselves out to be. I don't think that's the case for your typical person who's an evolutionist, because they just don't know. They just believe what they're taught, and they don't look into it. But if a person will open his eyes and look into it, he can see that that just can't be. All right, I'm going to let him wind it up for the next few minutes, and then we'll go to the text of Genesis.
Okay.
Here we go.
George Grant wanted to meet me at a garden near his home. He said it was a good reminder of where our history began. So there's something significant about the Genesis text in which Adam and Eve are then placed into a garden to tend it. That's more than just a story.
It's much more than just a story. One of the things that you see in Genesis chapter 1 is the structure for time. The universe is created for a 24-hour day. And so everything from the way our sleep cycles and the way our work cycles work all come from that definitive historical account there. When we get to Genesis chapter 2, we start to see the meaning and purpose of man. Of course, in Genesis chapter 3, we see the disruption of everything by the fall. The implications of an historical fall, an actual man and an actual woman who actually yielded to actual sin, have then implications all through the rest of the Bible. If you remove a literal Adam and Eve, that changes the whole shape of what history is and how history is remembered.
Is that because when we pull an Adam and Eve out of a historical record, we can then pretty much make up what we think about man and marriage and even sexuality?
Absolutely. The Apostle Paul understood the events of the early chapters of Genesis as formative, not only for our understanding of history, but for relationships between men and women and their children, the character and nature of marriage, rightness and wrongness in moral relations, including sexuality. All of that is assumed from those early chapters of Genesis, oftentimes quoting the passages verbatim.
It seems that even Peter is taking that event of the flood, for example, as a historical event and laying it in the context of what he's pointing to, a judgment that will come. So even judgment is a part of understanding that historical record.
You cut things off from history and you lose sight of the meaning of all of it.
I think most Christians, when we talk about, for example, the life of Christ, those are understood to be historical accounts. Why is it that when we look at the account in Genesis, that we have a tendency not to want to do that?
We have a tendency not to do it because we're constantly exhorted to not see it that way.
From the culture around us?
The culture around us, from theologians, modern theologians who are trying to somehow, in their minds, fit the truths of Scripture with the so-called discoveries of science, which, if you know anything about the history of science, you know is an incredibly unreliable path. So we're constantly bombarded with this message that we have to adjust our view.
But I think there are a lot of Christians who have a sense that the historicity of Genesis is just not that important to their Christianity.
I think we've been sold a bill of goods on that. When you somehow make those chapters a different category altogether and non-historical, what are you doing to all of the rest of the Bible? The Bible that assumes that it's true, the Bible that treats it as historically true, the Bible that refers back to all of the characters that are there. Does that then negate the whole of the Bible? Well, yes. And that's exactly what the strategy was of the higher critics in the 18th and 19th centuries. They knew if you could somehow attack the first 3 or the first 11 chapters of Genesis, you've done away with the whole thing.
Well, George, all of this brings us back then to the notion that the history that's recorded in Genesis, or any true history at all, is critical for us in terms of understanding what's going on around us.
Yeah, in fact, it reminds us of how important history is in anchoring all of the other human disciplines. It is history that helps to inform science so that science can begin its journey of discovery in the world. So what history does is it tells us what happened. Then what science attempts to do is it asks the question, well, how did it happen? And then it begins to explore the how, the mechanics, the structures that were present in those events. If you try and reverse that, if you try and make science saying what actually happened, then you wind up having a worldview that is constantly shifting where nothing is certain. And moral relativism is the necessary outcome.
And God has given us that bedrock. He's given us that foundation in that historical record.
He's given it to us in that historical record, going all the way back to Genesis chapter 1 and the garden.
In the end, I suppose we always return home. And for me, home is Colorado. I always think more clearly when I'm out in the beauty of God's creation. We've been a lot of places and seen a lot of things, but considering everything together, it's clear that nothing in the world makes sense except in the light of Genesis.
I love being in the mountains, especially ones like these. They help give us a good perspective, help us realize that we're small and finite and vulnerable. They humble us. And we need to be humble because we have a tendency to base our ideas on our own small set of experiences. That's why the wisdom of the ages has told us over and over again to know history. Everything that we have done up to this point has looked at the evidence that shows us that the Word of God, the history that has been laid down for us in Genesis, is true. God created the world in 6 days. There is a real Adam, a real Eve. There is a real fall. There was a real flood that destroyed the world and produced all of this. It is glorious, but it represents the judgment of God. Everything supports what God has told us. Genesis is history, true history.
All right, let me get that video shut down. Give me a second. All right, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Well, I hope the video was helpful. Um, the idea behind it is Genesis history, and the reason I guess that the person made the video is because there is so much being said and done, even in the church or in among those who claim Christianity, um, to make us think that it's not all history. And one of the things the guy pointed out in the last part of the video is that if you can cast doubt on the first 1, 2, or even 11 chapters of Genesis, then you have to cast doubt on everything in the Bible later on that refers back to that. If Jesus ever referred to anything from those chapters, then you have to doubt whether or not Jesus knew what he was talking about. If Peter ever referred to it, then Peter is brought into doubt. And Peter obviously did talk about it in his second epistle, or both epistles. So if Genesis 1 is mythology, or if it's legend, if it's just Hebrew poetry and you can't really count on any of it being accurate, then great portions of our Bible are undermined by that. And as he said, I think that was exactly the plan by those who, back in the 1800s, between the 16 and 1800s, those people that were referred to as higher critics, that's exactly what they were doing, trying to cast doubt. Got any questions or comments about the video?
Not at this time.
All righty. Well, let's go into the text of Genesis. Let's open up our Bibles and let's get started there. We won't have much time tonight, but we'll get little ways. What is one of the most unanswered questions about the book of Genesis? It's a really deep philosophical question. Did Adam have a belly button? It's a joke. You're supposed to laugh. Ha ha.
I did.
You didn't laugh loud enough. It is a question that people have. It's a silly question. Doesn't really matter. I don't care whether or not he had a belly button. We're not going to deal with it in this class, and couldn't deal with it anywhere anyway. The text does answer, however, the long debated question of which came first, the chicken or the egg? And that would be what?
I would say the chicken.
The chicken. God created the chicken. He didn't create the egg. And I suppose it's possible God could have created the egg and caused that chicken or the egg to hatch, but most likely God created the chicken. But again, that's not the kind of questions that we're looking into in our class on Genesis. And it's not the kind of questions that the author of the book of Genesis was addressing. He had a reason for writing this book, and it didn't have anything to do with belly buttons or chicken eggs. What was his reasoning? Why did he write this book? Well, we could say God told him to. But remember in our former discussions before we looked at the video, who is he writing this book to?
To the Jews that came out of Egypt.
We have to understand that we have to keep that in mind, that his initial audience, the ones that were receiving this book, now that's not to say that we can't receive benefit from it from the day, but the people who were that he was trying to tell something to, he was trying to tell it to them at the foot of Mount Sinai after they had just watched or been a participant in the 10 plagues and walked through the Red Sea and have been given miraculously water from the rock as they came to Mount Sinai. And then at Mount Sinai, they're going to stay there and wander around in different places for some years to come. But Moses is writing to those people who witnessed those things. What is he wanting to tell them? There is one God who is the creator of all things, who is doing what you are seeing being done. One author wrote it this way. He says that proclamation that there is one deity who is the creator of all things, that proclamation stood opposed to the pagan propaganda to which the people of God had been exposed for centuries. These people who are gathered at Mount Sinai, they had just come from Egypt. They had been in Egypt for several generations, and they were exposed, therefore, to all the things that Egypt believed and taught. They were exposed to that culture in Egypt. They were somewhat segregated from the culture in that they were in the land of Goshen, but because the land of Goshen was the most fertile land, the best part of the land of Egypt, a lot of Egyptians were there, and a lot of Egyptians moved there and would live there. Israel needed to know, and we'll talk about why this is, they needed to know that there was no uncontrollable chaos. There was no warfare in the beginning, only authoritative words from the Alpha, the Omega, from the Ancient of Days, from God himself, the God they had just witnessed, or whose power they had just witnessed. When you read the account, and I know you've read it many times, when you read the account of life at the time of the flood, Noah and the flood, do you get a sense of peace or chaos?
It was chaos.
Violent time, a horrible time. One of the things that was new to me from the video that we just watched, a new way of thinking for me, was that in the beginning, God created animals, and all things that he created, man and beast, they all ate from the vegetable kingdom. They were not carnivores. They didn't eat meat. It wasn't until some great time later that they ate meat. I don't know how long it was, but that brings into question, why do animals have teeth that are intended to eat meat? And what about Tyrannosaurus Rex, the dinosaur, who obviously was a meat eater? Where did all that come from? And he mentions in the video about these teeth and the claws and the violent nature of the animals. It seemed to me what he was saying, and I'll just give an illustration how it worked out in my mind. It's not exactly what he said. You take that lizard that God created in day 6. He had within him, his DNA had within him the potential to become that great, terrible lizard, that great dinosaur who would be violent and disastrous, and it would become that way as a result of the fall. That's what his speculation was, and I don't know if I buy into that completely. It's a new thought to me, but it does make sense that as a result of the fall, a lot of things changed. The earth was cursed, and what was the result of that curse? How did that curse affect the animal kingdom and so forth? How did that curse affect the relationship between man and the animals that God created in chapter 2? Maybe all of that comes together and helps us understand that. But there was, to say the least, at the time of the flood, life was chaotic. It was an upheaval. Every imagination of the thoughts of every man was evil, and evil continually. As you read on over in Genesis, you'll read about Sodom and Gomorrah. If you had lived there were actually 5 cities, but if you had lived among the 5 cities of that valley, would you get a general sense of peace or chaos?
It was chaotic.
Again, it's chaotic. The indication is that men were mean and violent and ungodly in several ways. And so life was not peaceful there. Life was in a state of chaos. You turn to the pages that speak later on outside of Genesis, that speak of the 10 northern tribes being overcome by the Assyrians. Peace or chaos? How much do you know about that time period?
I don't know a lot about that one, but it's probably was chaotic as well, because I know, like, with the different kings, the people wanted the kings, and God gave them the king, but still, each king was so evil that you had a few that were good, but still, I know this before or after, Adam and Eve, but still, that time frame was just, it was awful.
Yeah, when you get down to the time frame of the Assyrian kings and their assault upon the northern kings of, or the northern kingdom of Judah, we're talking barbarism that is beyond imagination and belief. The horrible things that the Assyrians did to people and to the kings, not only of Israel, but of the nations. Assyria was a very violent nation, and they were intent on taking over the world, and they didn't care how they did it. And it was some of the most, if just Google, you don't have to go to the Bible, just Google Assyrians from the Bible time frame of the, let's say, 1,000 years before Christ, somewhere in that time frame. I forget exactly when Assyria went under, but in that time frame, the barbaricism of the Assyrians, you're talking chaos to the extreme. And later on, a few years, Babylon comes into the story, and they come into Jerusalem as predicted, and destroying Jerusalem. Again, more chaos. It's not a situation of peace. The book of Habakkuk, the prophet Habakkuk, is kind of a, you think about it, kind of a funny book. Habakkuk is sitting up on the mountainside, and he's seeing how the people of Judah are conducting themselves, and he looks to God and said, God, how long are you going to let this go on? And he lists off the kind of evil and terrible things that the people of Judah were doing. How long are you going to let this go on? And God says, Habakkuk, I got a plan in mind. Let me tell you about it. And so he tells Habakkuk what he's going to do, and Habakkuk says, whoa, you can't do that. And it was what God said was that he was going to send the Babylonians in and to destroy Jerusalem. God, the point I'm trying to make is that God promised the Jews that he would be with them through all their troubles, through all their trials, if they remain faithful to him. He also promised them that there would be hell to pay if they did not remain faithful. The chaos which Babylon brought upon Judah, it wasn't a surprise to God. It wasn't God said, oh man, I didn't know that was going to happen. God forecasted. He said, he told them back when they were in the wilderness that if you do these things, this is what's going to happen to you, and it happened. I think God forecasted, God orchestrated it. God told Nebuchadnezzar through Daniel that God had put Nebuchadnezzar on the throne. And Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylon who came and destroyed Jerusalem. So God is working in the affairs of man to do the things that he intends to be done, one of which was to punish his own people for their unfaithfulness. The violence of Noah's day, the same thing. It wasn't as if it was a surprise to God. God knows, and he teaches us this throughout the Bible, that when the world steps away from God, it steps into chaos. God is the God of peace. And when we step away from God, we step into chaos. We bring chaos into our lives, whether we speak of the world in general or as a whole, or we as individuals. When we step away from God, we end up in divorce. When we step away from God, we end up as alcoholics. When we step away from God, we end up in all kinds of chaos in our lives, depending on in what way we stepped away from God. God knows that, and God has warned of it repeatedly throughout the Bible. The New Testament takes it, I think, a step further, especially in the book of, the letter of 1 Peter, showing us as Christians how to make peace in the chaos of sin by following the way of God. We live, Peter says, in a world that is away from God. Peter says, I want you to live as strangers and pilgrims in that world. I don't want you to separate yourself from the world. I'm not going to take you out of the world. I'm going to keep you there in that world. He mentions, or he writes to the people of Cappadocia and Asia and Bithynia and Pontus and Galatia, and he says, I don't want you to leave those countries. That's where you're from, or those areas. That's where you're from. I want you to stay there, but I want you to live there differently than the people who live there. Even though you're from there and your family's from there, don't live like them, but live there among them like God would have you to live. Follow God's way, even in the chaos of sin. And if you will do that, God will bring blessing not only into your life, but into their lives by choosing to live that way that Peter talks about in that letter. It's a very hard letter, not to understand, but to apply. It's a very hard letter. And a lot of people don't teach it the way Peter taught it because it's so in conflict with what they feel is their rights or, their rights. It's not the way I would do it, so that's not the way I'm going to do it. But if we'll look at the book of 1 Peter, as Peter wrote it, he's telling us to live like God would among those people, even to the point of sacrifice, so that you can reach their souls. Whether it's the slave reaching the master's soul, or the wife reaching the husband's soul, or the citizen reaching the governor's soul, you live among the people, or among that people as God would have you to, and you will have the opportunity to reach them. Whether or not they allow themselves to be reached is another question. The way the world, or the way of God, doesn't make sense from a worldly perspective. But if we as Christians will trust God, it will work. The worldly perspective is biased or blinded by the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, and the pride of life. The world has been blinded to the way of the Spirit, and that produces the works of the flesh. You read those. The works of the flesh are these: adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lewdness, idolatry, sorcery, contentions, jealousies, outbursts of wrath, selfish ambitions, dissensions, heresies, murders, drunkenness, revelries, and the like, of which I tell you before, as I told you in times past, those who practice these things will not inherit the kingdom of God. When you read that list of works of the flesh, you get an idea of chaos. You get an idea of Genesis chapter 6 of the way the world was back then. You get an idea of what it was like in Sodom and Gomorrah. You and I, as people of Christ, we've had those blinders removed, but we still live in that world. A world that's controlled by people who are blinded by their lust. So how do we deal with that world? Well, we trust the way of God. We trust the way that He has shown us as being good and very good, that was created from the chaos. Look in Genesis chapter 1. Listen to what it says. hear it in a different way than maybe you've heard it before. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was what? Without form. The earth was without form. What does that mean, without form? Just think of a
Plain.
it has no form to it. It's I think the guy on the video says it's a water ball. There's no form to it. It's not a square. It's not a shape or anything. There's no form to it. And it is void. What does it mean, void? Well, empty is another word for void. Without life is another word for void. So look at these descriptions. When you describe without form, void, darkness upon the face of the deep, what is that a description of? What do you see there? It's chaos. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and in the beginning, at the beginning of the process, it was chaotic. Why did God do that? Why didn't he just create it, boom, it's all created, everything's hunky-dory? Why do we have to have the 7 days of creation for God to set these things in order? Well, I think Moses is telling the people of Israel there in the wilderness something that they needed to hear because of what they had been taught in Egypt. It says here in verse 2, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters, and God said, let there be light, and what? There was light. In the midst of chaos, in the midst of darkness, God simply spoke, light, and it was. Who can do that? Who can create, organize, or organization from chaos just by speaking it? Well, the God who just split the Red Sea so that you could come through it. The God who just caused all those 10 plagues and destroyed those Egyptian gods so that to prove to you that there is no other God. It's that God who brought you out upon eagle's wings. To me, this is one of the most amazing statements in the entire Bible, that God, from the chaos that he created, brought forth organization or the life that we have today. Moses wanted his initial readers there at Mount Sinai, and for his 21st century readers today, he wanted all of us in between to know that the God of Genesis is in control. There is no chaos so great that it can overtake God or overtake God's plans. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It was one big chaotic mess, but God is more powerful than that one big chaotic mess, and he can bring organization, or he can bring organized life from that. Get the idea?
Yes, sir. And I think also too, Moses, like you said, when he did that, you said that he wanted to show the people that even when they having issues in life, that God can bring them out of chaos.
That's exactly it. That's exactly it, Vince. That's exactly what Moses wants them to get, that they're going to go through some troubles and trials of their own in the next 40 years and in the next several hundred years. And even us today, we're going to experience times in our life where things are chaotic. A wife's going to walk out, or a child's going to die, or something is going to happen that brings chaos into our life. And God says, I can get you through this. Trust me.
Right. Mm-hmm.
If I can take this muddy water ball of chaos and just speak things into existence, and it all comes into an organized thing that you see before you today, what can I not do? You've been taught, he's telling them, by the Egyptians that gods were formed out of the chaos, and those gods then had to use magical incantations to defeat the chaos. I was not created from the chaos, God says. I created it, and with just a word from my mouth, let it be, I tamed it. And it was. You follow me, and there will be no chaos in your life that I cannot handle. It's not to say there's not going to be chaos in your life. It's to say there's no chaos in your life that I cannot handle. Follow me, trust me. I think that's the import, the introduction, if you please, to Genesis chapter 1 from Moses to those people. Genesis, we spent 3.5 weeks studying how Genesis provides us a scientific answer to some of our scientific modern day questions and problems. That's not why Moses wrote Genesis chapter 1. We can use it in that way. It's a good platform to use in that way, but that's not the reason God gave us. It's not an anti-evolutionary creed. It teaches it against evolution just by the very fact of it. Moses, however, never heard of evolution. He's not going to be saying, well, let me tell you about Genesis chapter 1 so that you won't believe in evolution. Moses never heard of evolution. Genesis is not at enmity with true science. Genesis is not anti-science. Science and the Bible don't always agree, particularly scientists and the Bible don't always agree, but the Bible never disagrees with what is found to be true science. I don't want you to blindly follow God, but I want you to see that Genesis doesn't require you to drop your faith at the door of the church building or the door of the science classroom. It's a scientific book, but that's not why Moses wrote it. Studying the opening chapters of Genesis is a good opportunity to go into those subjects like we have done, but that's not why he wrote it. Michael Whitworth, I think, had it right when he says it this way. Science might not be able to explain the flood or the destruction of Sodom, but it will never be able to, or it says, science might be able to explain the flood. Science might be able to explain the destruction of Sodom, but it will never be able to explain the virgin birth or an empty tomb. Because science can't explain the virgin birth doesn't mean, I'm going to give up my faith. Because science can't explain the resurrected Jesus. Science can't prove it, so I guess I won't believe it. No, I believe it. Whether science can prove it or not, whether or not science proves or disproves the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, doesn't matter to me. Whether or not science proves or disproves in their own way of thinking the flood, I don't care. The Bible says that it's true. But the fact is, science does prove the flood to be at least a viable option for how the rocks turned out like they are. And there is scientific evidence that something happened in Sodom and Gomorrah. But even if there's not, I still believe, just like I still believe that Mary was a virgin when she had Jesus. Can't prove it. Can't happen again. It was a miracle. And science can't prove miracles. My point is, you shouldn't have to have confirmation from science in order to believe. There is lots of confirmation from science, but we don't have to have it to believe. Whitworth further says, Moses wanted to refute error, but this is not his primary purpose. More than anything, Moses wanted Israel's God to be exalted as Lord of all. And that's what these first 2 chapters of Genesis are about. This is what the Bible is about, and that's what we should be about, exalting our God to be Lord of all, or that he is Lord of all. God is sovereign. There is no God beside him. It is the foundational truth of the Bible stated clearly in these opening passages. It is the foundational, it is as foundational to the Bible as the confession that Jesus Christ is the Son of God is the foundation to the church. The 2 things are solid rocks, and we cannot take away those foundations without doing damage to either the Bible or the church. All right, next week, we got about 10 minutes left, but I'm going to stop here. We're going to jump into the text of Genesis chapter 1 and 2 and move on from there.
Okie dokie.
I appreciate you guys' attention. I hope the video was of sufficient quality that you got something good, good from it.
I did.
Let me write down here my notes where I'm supposed to begin next week. All right, guys.
All right.
You guys have a good week, and I look forward to seeing you next week.
Yes, sir. You do the same, Mike.
All right. God bless.
Same to you.